It was the day of the succession ritual, the ceremony that would determine the next heir to the throne through a magic aptitude test. As the seventh prince, Ryan already knew where he stood. In the Empire, hair color wasn't just a matter of appearance, it was a symbol of magical talent. The brighter a person's hair, the greater the magic power they possessed, and those blessed with such power were considered true royalty. Ryan, however, had been born with black hair. In the eyes of the imperial family, that made him no different from a crow. During the ceremony, each prince sat according to rank while waiting for the ritual to begin. Even among all his children, there was one undeniable truth. Their father, the emperor, was the strongest of them all. As the first prince stepped forward to begin the test, according to his memories, this was exactly how things were supposed to happen. But it didn't go as planned. Everything had started in an office during his previous life. A so-called high-level businessman had approached him with a money-doubling scheme, claiming they only wanted to help. At the time, he had been desperate. Even after his father passed away, he still had to work tirelessly just to survive. He knew something felt off, but there wasn't much a broke guy like him could do. In the end, he took the bait. His money vanished faster than a crypto rug pull. 2 years later, his life had completely fallen apart. He could barely keep himself together. Sometimes, even after buying snacks for a meal, he ended up throwing them back up. As an ordinary 28-year-old man living in South Korea, his life was anything but normal. Every miserable day traced back to the scammer who had run away with his money, leaving him buried under a mountain of debt. After finishing a 5-hour shift at his part-time job one evening, he returned home and picked up his favorite novel, Dark Heather. No matter how many times he read it, opening that book always made him feel a little better. It was his escape from reality, the one place where he could forget his problems for a while. As he read, something outside the window caught his attention. A black crow feather drifted through the air, then blood suddenly poured from his nose and mouth, splattering across the pages of the book. His heart stopped beating. He couldn't breathe. At the very same moment, the book began radiating a strange dark energy, and just like that, his already shitty life came to an abrupt end. The next time he opened his eyes, he was somewhere completely different. At first, he assumed he was dreaming, but the room surrounding him was far too luxurious to belong to someone like him. When he glanced out the window, he spotted dozens of crows perched on a nearby tree. One of them stared directly at him before letting out a loud call. Thinking it was still some bizarre dream, he tried to calm himself down. Then the crow suddenly started acting friendly, which only made the situation even weirder. As he approached the window, he froze on the spot. 3 moons hung high in the night sky. Beneath them stretched a massive city that looked strangely familiar. The moment he caught sight of his reflection, the truth slammed into him like a truck. He had become Ryan Aberon, the 7th prince of the Aberon Empire. Just then, a maid named Anna called from outside his room. Startled, he hurriedly tried to stop her from entering, only to lose his balance and crash onto the floor. Somehow, Anna immediately seemed to understand what had happened. She quickly apologized and said she would come back later. After hearing her voice and taking in his surroundings once more, there was no longer any room for doubt. This world was the setting of novel, Dark Heather. Unfortunately, there was one massive problem. Out of every character he could have possessed, he had become Ryan Aberon. Unlike the powerful princes who dominated the story, Ryan was a doomed character destined to suffer a miserable death early in the novel. Left alone in the room, he could only curse his unbelievably terrible luck. Just then, a butler named Sign arrived, his dark glasses giving him an even more intimidating presence. The moment Ryan heard the name, recognition clicked instantly. Entering the room, the butler calmly explained that he had personally accompanied the maid to deliver the prince's dinner. After adjusting his glasses, he politely asked whether the prince's health had improved. Not wanting to die on his very first day in this world, Ryan forced himself to stay composed. Putting on a polite smile, he claimed that he was feeling much better. Seemingly satisfied with the answer, Sign gave a small nod and immediately instructed the maid to prepare the table. As the meal was being set up, Ryan quickly noticed 2 things. First, the maid was trembling so badly that she looked as though she might collapse at any moment. Second, the food itself looked more suitable for a stray dog than a prince. Wanting to make things easier for her, he reached for the teapot to pour his own tea. Unfortunately, his hand accidentally brushed against the maid's. The teapot tilted, and scalding tea spilled across the table. The maid's face instantly lost all color. Dropping to her knees, she desperately begged for mercy while staring at the spreading puddle. Completely baffled, Ryan watched her frantically try to clean the mess as though her life depended on it. In her mind, she seemed convinced that she was about to be executed. Only then did he remember the reputation of this body's original owner. Prince Ryan had been a cruel and sadistic tyrant who punished servants for the smallest mistakes and had even ordered executions over completely trivial matters. Trying to ignore the awkward situation, Ryan sat down and prepared to eat. Unfortunately, another interruption arrived almost immediately. Wearing a cynical expression, Sign stepped forward carrying a document. Without offering any explanation, he casually dropped it onto the prince's table and stated that an urgent signature was required. Picking up the quill, Ryan examined the papers, wondering what kind of ridiculous business a fool like the original Ryan could possibly be involved in. It only took a brief glance to uncover the truth. The documents were little more than a scheme designed to siphon money from the estate's budget. Sign could act this boldly because of his connections to the Empress. Since the original Ryan was notoriously foolish, the reincarnated prince briefly considered whether he should simply sign the papers to keep events moving along the same path as the novel. Sign, meanwhile, meanwhile, smirked and mockingly asked whether his master had forgotten how to write his own name. Irritated by the blatant disrespect, Ryan silently cursed his fate for ending up in the body of such a pathetic prince. Then it happened again. Just like the scammer from his previous life, Sign repeated the exact same manipulative tactic. There was no need to think, he implied. All the prince had to do was sign. The words immediately dragged Ryan back to the worst memory of his life. He could practically see the smiling face of the scammer who had ruined him. It was the same attitude, the same pressure, and the same promise that everything would work out if he simply signed his name. His jaw tightened. The situation felt almost identical to the one that had destroyed his life. The only difference was that this time he saw it coming. He swore that he would never allow himself to be fooled again. Without hesitation, he questioned the numbers listed in the report and calmly pointed out the obvious embezzlement. For the first time, Sign looked genuinely surprised. A strange smile crossed the assistant's face as he remarked that he had underestimated the prince's intelligence. Even so, he quickly attempted to change the subject and casually suggested that the prince should sign before the food became cold. Before Sign could finish speaking, a pitcher suddenly flew across the table. The maid instantly flinched and curled into herself in terror. A loud crash echoed through the room as the pitcher shattered at the assistant's feet. Water splashed across his clothing while broken fragments scattered across the floor. Sign stared at the wreckage in complete confusion. Ryan, meanwhile, remained perfectly calm and casually explained that his hand had slipped. The truth was that Sign's supposed connection to the Empress was nowhere near as impressive as he pretended. In reality, the Empress didn't even know he existed. Leaning comfortably into his chair, Ryan acted as though nothing unusual had happened. Sane, however, could hardly comprehend the dramatic change in the prince's behavior. Determined to change his destiny, Ryan calmly blamed the accident on the assistant's distraction and stated that he should take responsibility for the mess. He had no intention of remaining a powerless victim. Armed with his knowledge of the novel, he planned to survive and eventually seize control of his own fate. Sign hesitated as cold sweat slowly formed on his forehead. Then, with a simple gesture, Ryan pointed toward the water soaking into the expensive carpet and ordered the man to clean it up. Within the empire, members of the royal family were treated as beings beyond question. Their golden hair and overwhelming magical abilities made them appear almost perfect in the eyes of the people. Ryan Aberin, however, was the one exception. Unlike the rest of the imperial bloodline, he possessed ordinary black hair and carried the reputation of a complete fool. Throughout the empire, he was known as the disgrace of the royal family. Sign knew that reputation better than anyone. In fact, he still remembered all the bribes he had paid in an attempt to avoid being assigned to serve such a prince. Unfortunately for him, even money couldn't overcome a direct royal order. No matter how much resentment he felt, the authority of the imperial family was absolute. Swallowing his pride, he reluctantly knelt beside the maid and began cleaning the spilled tea from the floor. After finishing the task, Sign stood up and announced that the carpet had been cleaned. Unfortunately for him, Ryan wasn't finished. The very next moment, another teacup flew through the air and shattered right in front of him. Ryan calmly observed the new mess before remarking that Sign's cleaning skills still seemed to need improvement. A dangerous red gleam flashed through the prince's eyes as he ordered the man to clean everything again, this time faster than before. The command immediately pushed Sign closer to his limit. Growing increasingly desperate, he attempted to invoke the Empress's name as a final threat, hoping it would force the prince to back down. Unfortunately for him, Ryan knew exactly what kind of bluff it was. The assistant's supposed connection to the Empress wasn't nearly as significant as he pretended. Deciding it was time to completely crush the man's arrogance, Ryan shifted his attention toward the trembling maid. Pointing directly at her, he ordered her to cover her ears tightly. Then, in a cold and chilling voice, he warned that if she heard even a single word of what was about to be said, he would personally remove her fingers. The threat was enough to terrify her completely. The maid pressed both hands firmly against her ears. Then Ryan turned back toward Sign and spoke several dark and mysterious words. Whatever he said was enough to completely shatter the assistant's composure. With every sentence, Sign's expression changed dramatically. The anger disappeared first, then his confidence vanished. Before long, only pure terror remained. His face turned deathly pale, and sweat poured down his body as though he had just witnessed something truly horrifying. Several days later, rumors about the prince's sudden transformation had spread throughout the castle. Groups of maids gathered in the courtyard and exchanged stories while carrying out their duties. During one such conversation, Anna remarked that the atmosphere within the mansion had become noticeably heavier and far more intimidating than before. Despite that, most of them agreed on one thing: they were relieved. Ever since that day, the prince had spent most of his time locked inside his room and rarely interacted with anyone. As the conversation continued, one of the maids casually reminded Anna that she was supposed to be handling cleaning duties. The young maid immediately stiffened at the reminder. Meanwhile, far away from the gossip and rumors, the castle library remained peaceful. Sitting comfortably with a cup of tea in hand, Ryan quietly celebrated the success of his intimidation tactics. Nobody bothered him anymore. Even the troublesome butler had completely disappeared from sight after narrowly avoiding having another dish thrown at him. As he carefully considered his future, the former self remembered that he still had 3 years before the point in the story when Prince Ryan was destined to die. Having read Dark Heather countless times in his previous life, he possessed knowledge of future events that nobody else in the world could possibly possibly know. With such an enormous advantage in hand, he came to a simple conclusion. Until the true protagonist finally entered the stage, he intended to enjoy every luxury royal life had to offer. Sitting by the window, Ryan gazed up at the beautiful blue sky stretching endlessly above the castle. As he watched the clouds drift by, a casual thought crossed his mind. It would be pretty amazing to fly freely through the sky like a bird. Suddenly, a wave of pain struck without warning, so intense that it instantly filled him with dread. Every nerve seemed to scream at once. The luxurious teacup slipped from his hand and crashed onto the stone floor, shattering into pieces. Ryan collapsed alongside it, writhing in agony as an unbearable burning sensation spread throughout his body. The pain was overwhelming, far worse than anything he had ever experienced in either of his lives. Gritting his teeth, he desperately tried to endure it, but the suffering only continued to intensify. At that very moment, Anna knocked on the door and politely asked for permission to enter and clean the room. Meanwhile, Ryan could do nothing but silently beg for help. After receiving no response, the maid cautiously opened the door and stepped inside. Not seeing the prince anywhere in the large room, she immediately let out a sigh of relief. At least she wouldn't have to face him today. However, after taking a few steps forward, she noticed the shattered remains of the expensive teacup scattered across the office floor. As she carefully collected the luxurious porcelain fragments, she couldn't help mourning the waste. In her mind, something that valuable could have fed her humble family for months. Then a strange rustling sound echoed from behind a piece of furniture. The unexpected noise instantly caught her attention. To her surprise, a small crow with glowing red eyes suddenly emerged from the corner of the room. The bird stared directly at her in an unusually strange way before awkwardly hopping across the stone floor in her direction. Anna watched the bizarre behavior with confusion. Feeling sorry for the little creature, she gently picked it up and cradled it in her arms. She then warned the bird that it needed to leave immediately because a very cruel man lived there. Hearing those words, the crow was completely stunned. At that moment, Ryan finally realized the horrifying truth. Somehow, during that unbearable pain, he had transformed from Prince Ryan into a crow. His mind raced as he desperately tried to make sense of the situation. A moment later, Anna opened the window. She warned the bird that if the prince caught them together, both of them would be eliminated. Ryan immediately tried to scream that he was the prince, but only silent protests came out. Ignoring the crow's obvious panic, Anna carefully held him up before tossing him out through the open window. The moment he left her hands, pure terror exploded inside his mind. He was falling fast. The castle stood at a massive and incredibly dangerous height, and the ground below was rushing toward him at an alarming speed. Ryan went into full panic mode, convinced he was moments away from being crushed into a smear on the ground. Inside his head, he screamed desperately, while frantically searching for a way to survive. As the terrifying freefall continued, Ryan realized there was only one option left. If he wanted to live, he needed to learn how to use his new wings immediately. Panic completely overtook his thoughts as he forced himself to flap them with everything he had. Again and again, he pushed himself, determined to avoid a horrible death. Then, at the very last second, it happened. His body stabilized, the rapid descent slowed, and suddenly he was no longer falling. Instead, he was floating in the air. Ryan stared in disbelief as he began gliding smoothly through the wind. Even after surviving the ordeal, he could hardly believe what had happened. Somehow, against all odds, he had actually learned how to fly. But that relief didn't last long. Now that he had become a crow, would he ever be able to return to his human form? Hours later, night settled over the palace, and the 3 colorful moons glowed brightly through the dark, cloud-covered sky. Thankfully, Ryan had managed to transform back into a human safely. To make sure it wasn't a one-time fluke, he repeated the transformation several more times. Each attempt confirmed the same unbelievable truth. He could now turn into a crow whenever he wanted, through sheer willpower alone. The discovery left him stunned. As he tried tracing the source of this bizarre ability, he quickly realized something even stranger. This power had never existed in the novel's original story. Whatever was happening here was completely outside the plot he knew. Because of that, Ryan understood one thing very clearly: this secret had to stay buried. Revealing an unknown power could throw the entire timeline into chaos and completely destroy his plans for survival. A knock soon came from his bedroom door. A servant informed him that the nightly ritual would begin shortly and that he needed to prepare immediately. Hearing those words, Ryan's expression turned serious. The long-awaited day had finally arrived. What appeared to be a simple monthly royal gathering was actually a succession test, one where the 7th prince was usually ignored like he didn't even exist. After entering the enormous hall, Ryan took his seat at the very end of the massive table. Seeing the palace's luxury up close felt completely different from reading about it. Around him, his blonde-haired brothers whispered among themselves with obvious disdain. Before long, a prince from the opposite side of the table loudly mocked him, demanding to know how an idiot like Ryan dared to raise his head so shamelessly. The speaker was Salos Aberon, the 8th prince and Ryan's younger half-brother, a guy who openly despised him and showed zero respect. When nobody paid attention to his outburst, Salos angrily slammed his hand against the table. Ironically, neither of them realized they were both insignificant secondary villains in the grand story of the novel. Before things could escalate, the first princess calmly placed a hand on Salos's shoulder and scolded him. The effect was immediate. The arrogant prince instantly fell silent and apologized in fear. As Ryan observed the hall, he noticed that every important prince was seated according to rank. He remembered one of the world's basic rules: the brighter a noble's hair, the greater their magical power, known as manus. The previous owner of Ryan's body had possessed black hair and no magical ability whatsoever, making him the only prince without manus. That fact explained a lot about the bitterness and twisted personality the original 7th prince had developed. Then heavy footsteps echoed throughout the hall. The room instantly fell silent as the most feared and powerful man in the empire made his entrance. An imposing figure with long, shining white hair walked toward the center of the banquet hall with overwhelming authority. Every noble present lowered their head before the emperor, a legendary ruler who governed the nation with an absolute iron fist. Without wasting a second, the emperor ordered the test to begin. He stepped toward an ancient blue stone slab and explained that the sacred relic measured the magical power of anyone who touched it. The moment his hand landed on the relic, a violent surge of blue energy exploded outward. A massive beam of light shot across the hall, instantly demonstrating the terrifying amount of power he possessed. The released energy spread across nearly the entire table, leaving the princes stunned by the sheer difference between themselves and the emperor. After displaying his strength, the ruler called for any heir who wished to measure their power to step forward. Remaining silent at the end of the table, Ryan watched carefully as the testing began. Soon, one of the older princes confidently volunteered to go first. Ryan remembered that under normal circumstances, only the first prince participated in this ritual because the rankings rarely changed. Every year, the crown prince used this ceremony as a public display of dominance, reminding every noble exactly who stood at the top of the royal hierarchy and who was destined to become the next emperor. But this time, something went horribly wrong. In the middle of his grand display, the first prince suddenly groaned in pain. His face twisted, and his body began showing signs of severe distress. One of his brothers immediately jumped from his seat and shouted in panic. Moments later, the crown prince violently coughed up fluid, throwing the entire hall into chaos. Servants rushed around frantically. Nobles screamed for doctors. Panic spread through the banquet hall like wildfire. Yet amidst all that confusion, Ryan remained the only person who understood exactly what was happening. According to the novel's original plot, this was the moment the first prince was supposed to die. His body would suffer catastrophic internal damage, leading to his tragic early death, and that single event would officially mark the beginning of the mysterious and deadly story our boy had been thrown into. Ryan remembered that magical abilities only appeared within the royal bloodline, but every royal possessed a completely unique power. The first prince wielded water magic, while the second prince had mastered fire. What bothered Ryan was that none of what he had just witnessed should have happened. According to the original story, the first prince's power measurement was only supposed to cover a little over half of the massive stone table. More importantly, there were still 6 whole months left before the disaster that should have crippled him. Yet somehow, that event had been pushed forward without warning. The timeline had changed. That realization sent a chill through Ryan. His own situation made even less sense. The 7th prince was never supposed to have any magic at all, yet immediately after Ryan took over the body, he gained the ability to transform into a crow. A completely new power appearing at the exact same time as his possession felt far too suspicious to be dismissed as coincidence. Meanwhile, inside his private chambers, the first prince was completely losing control. Furious and desperate, he smashed anything within reach, venting the frustration building inside him. Several objects were destroyed before he finally punched his bedroom mirror, shattering it into pieces. Unable to accept what had happened, he desperately attempted to use his water magic again, hoping to prove that his strength was still there. Instead, the moment he activated his power, unbearable agony tore through his body. He collapsed to his knees, coughing violently as intense pain burned through him. Horror quickly replaced anger as he realized the terrifying truth. Every attempt to use magic only made the pain worse. For the first time, he feared that he might never be able to wield his power again. Even so, he stubbornly refused to accept reality. Staggering to his feet, he kept reminding himself that he was the first prince, the legitimate heir to the empire, far superior to every other prince. In his mind, this had to be nothing more than a temporary setback. While trying to calm himself with a smoke, a mysterious voice suddenly emerged from the darkness, warning him to put it down if he wanted to survive. Startled, the prince immediately spun around and demanded to know who dared enter his room uninvited. The figure calmly stepped out of the shadows. When questioned about how he had gotten inside, he casually replied that he had simply climbed the outer wall. The answer sounded ridiculous, but the intruder coldly remarked that whether the prince believed him or not made little difference. The visitor then asked how he was feeling, fully aware that the palace doctors had likely lied and claimed he was perfectly healthy. The first prince responded with a sarcastic laugh, attempting to hide his growing fear. Moments later, that laugh turned into loud, almost hysterical laughter laughter as he desperately tried to appear intimidating before his younger brother. Ryan, however, remained completely calm, watching the performance without the slightest reaction. Frustrated by that indifference, the prince accused Ryan of poisoning him and intentionally planning to use the antidote later as leverage. Consumed by anger, he lunged forward with an outstretched hand, shouting that Ryan's scheme had failed. But before he could reach him, Ryan's next words stopped him cold. He calmly warned that within a week, the prince would be begging for death while suffering unimaginable torment. The first prince froze instantly. Sweat formed across his face as dread replaced his rage. Taking a seat on the couch as if discussing the weather, Ryan explained that he had not poisoned him and had no hidden plot against him. He revealed that the prince's body would continue breaking down until it eventually destroyed him, and admitted that even he didn't yet know who the true culprit was. Looking directly at him, Ryan stressed that listening carefully was absolutely crucial. Then he delivered the final blow, making it crystal clear that this conversation represented the prince's last opportunity to save his own life. Afterward, Ryan transformed back into a crow and flew away into the night. As he soared through the skies, he couldn't help feeling relieved. His older brother was every bit as cowardly and gullible as he had been in the original novel. That made him easy to manipulate and potentially useful for Ryan's future survival plans. The more he used his transformation ability, the more he appreciated how practical it was. Traveling across the Empire had become incredibly convenient. Since he was already outside his quarters, Ryan decided he might as well handle a few additional matters before returning. Heavy rain soon began pouring over the imperial capital, but the small crow continued flying swiftly through the dark sky without slowing down. By the following morning, sunlight once again illuminated the palace grounds. Outside Ryan's room, Maid Anna stood nervously in front of the door. The prince hadn't eaten a single thing for 2 days, and her imagination was running wild. Terrified that something terrible might have happened to him, she feared the palace guards would punish her severely if he were harmed. Eventually, her anxiety overwhelmed her. Trembling with fear, she began knocking loudly on the door while repeatedly calling for the prince. Suddenly, the door swung open. Ryan appeared without warning and asked what all the noise was about. The shock caused Anna to lose her balance completely. She fell face first onto the hallway floor, sending the entire food tray flying from her hands. Dishes shattered across the luxurious carpet as food spilled everywhere. To make matters worse, the mess splattered directly onto Ryan's black shoes. The maid's face immediately turned pale with terror. Ryan simply stared at her with a completely blank expression, making the situation feel even more suffocating. Convinced her life was over, Anna dropped to her knees and desperately begged for mercy. Through tears, she explained that she had only wanted to help him stay healthy. She trembled while remembering all the horrifying rumors surrounding the violent seventh prince, and even pleaded for her family's safety. What she didn't know was that Ryan was merely trying to maintain the image of his cruel character. To her complete surprise, he didn't punish her at all. Instead, he gruffly ordered her to clean everything up within 5 minutes and disappear from his sight. He then coldly warned her never to enter his room again unless summoned, simply wanting to avoid more pointless interruptions in his daily routine. A full month had passed since the shocking incident during the sacred ritual, where the first prince suddenly became ill and suffered severe damage while measuring his power. Since then, a dangerous rumor had quietly spread throughout the palace. People were whispering that the crown prince had completely lost his magic. For the princes and princesses secretly eyeing the throne, that rumor was a golden opportunity. If the heir to the empire had truly become powerless, the balance of power would change overnight. Determined to crush those rumors before they spiraled further, the first prince personally begged the emperor to move up the empire's highly anticipated hunting competition. Ryan felt relieved when he heard the news because, despite the timeline changes, events were finally starting to follow the original novel again. Even so, he couldn't help worrying about how all these alterations might affect the true protagonist of the story. When the day of the grand hunting competition finally arrived, Ryan hoped he might get lucky enough to encounter the novel's actual main character. His thoughts were interrupted when an irritating voice loudly called him a bug in front of the crowd. One of his arrogant brothers had decided to mock him again, this time making fun of Ryan's black horse. Ryan silently observed that the prince seemed far more impulsive than he had been in the original novel, but he had no intention of wasting time on pointless arguments. Ignoring the taunts completely, he focused on the reason he had come. In truth, he actually liked his black horse, and had realized that the seventh prince possessed a surprisingly natural talent for taming animals. After riding beneath the open sky for some time, Ryan and the gathered nobles finally reached the competition grounds. Before them stood the entrance to the enormous imperial forest, a vast and mysterious woodland filled with magic. In the distance, Ryan spotted the Tower of Beginnings, the sacred location where the annual opening ritual was always held. He knew the hunting competition would officially begin the moment the first prince completed the traditional ceremony. However, everyone present understood that this event was far more than a simple hunt. It was a ruthless battlefield of royal politics where heirs competed for influence, prestige, and power. The emperor soon turned toward the first prince and coldly ordered him to begin the ritual without delay. One of the princes immediately made a fake comment about how healthy the crown prince appeared and provocatively asked what wish he planned to request from the emperor after winning. The remark referred to the special privilege awarded to the competition's victor, the right to make a direct request to the Emperor himself. Acting completely confident, the first prince claimed victory before the event had even begun. Under countless watchful eyes, he started climbing the tower's stairs. As he ascended, whispers spread through the gathered nobles. Many openly discussed the rumors that he had lost his magic. Despite maintaining a composed appearance, the crown prince was extremely tense. While approaching the sacred relic, he silently prayed that Ryan's advice wasn't some elaborate scam. Among the anxious crowd below, Ryan simply watched with a faint smirk, completely confident in what was about to happen. Meanwhile, the crown prince swore to himself that if Ryan had deceived him, he would make his younger brother suffer the most painful death imaginable. Seeing how nervous and stiff Rasha looked, Ryan merely hoped he wouldn't lose his composure. After all, if the prince had followed his instructions exactly, something spectacular was about to unfold. The instant Rasha touched the sacred relic, an enormous torrent of glowing blue magic erupted into the sky. The explosion of energy was so massive that it burst through the tower and spread across the entire area. A gigantic whirlpool of magical power expanded wildly overhead, terrifying everyone present. The released energy became so violent that it generated a literal hurricane of magic. Powerful winds swept through the grounds, throwing guards and nobles backward as panic erupted. One guard shouted for everyone to retreat immediately, but Ryan remained perfectly calm, watching the chaos unfold. Rasha, however, refused to yield. Reminding himself that he was the first prince of the empire, he endured the crushing pressure and stubbornly held his ground. Through gritted teeth, he shouted his own name before releasing even more power. Then, at the top of his lungs, he declared that he alone was destined to become emperor. In response, a colossal blue dragon formed in the sky from the overwhelming amount of magical energy. The gigantic whirlpool descended from the heavens with terrifying force, illuminating the dark sky in brilliant blue light. The entire army gathered below was left speechless. Soldiers, nobles, and commoners alike stood frozen after witnessing such absurd power. Even the Duke watched with genuine admiration, acknowledging that this was the true might of the royal bloodline. Moments later, the crowd erupted into cheers, shouting praises for the first prince and celebrating the incredible display they had just witnessed. Ryan couldn't help remembering an earlier conversation with Rasha. Back then, he had handed the crown prince a strange dark stone. Rasha had immediately assumed he was being mocked, but Ryan calmly explained that the stone could absorb polluted magical power. He also bluntly stated that if Rasha wanted to die, he was free to ignore it. Hearing that Ryan had no intention of saving him against his own will only made the prince even angrier. Back in the present, Ryan prepared his horse and reflected on how useful it had been to use that item ahead of schedule compared to the original story. At that moment, his exhausted assistant Sign finally arrived, carrying an enormous backpack. Breathing heavily, Sign greeted the seventh prince and informed him that he had brought everything exactly as ordered. Ryan simply remarked that it had taken him long enough to get there. Putting on a stern expression, he criticized Sign for struggling with such a simple task. Internally, however, Sign was furious. He still couldn't understand how Ryan had survived the wild horse he had deliberately given him in hopes that the prince would get seriously injured. The loud blast of a horn suddenly echoed across the entire area, instantly grabbing everyone's attention. Raising his hand, the emperor officially declared the beginning of the event. The grand hunting competition had finally started. Riders immediately kicked their mounts forward and charged toward the forest at full speed. Some participants dreamed of claiming victory and earning a wish from the emperor, while others already knew the royal family would probably dominate the competition once again. Unlike the rest, Ryan showed no urgency whatsoever. He deliberately kept a low profile, wanting to avoid attracting unnecessary attention. His true objective had nothing to do with winning. He was searching for the former commander of the Imperial Knights, Duke Agony Fetus. At that moment, the Duke was chatting with his assistant, Tolan, who looked unusually excited. Tolan commented that the opening ritual they had just witnessed felt like the display of an actual god. The Duke casually replied that the Emperor's real goal had simply been to crush the spirits of the nobles. The blunt remark shocked Tolan, who quickly begged him not to say such things publicly. The old man simply told him to relax, since nobody was listening. Then, with a serious expression, he added that there was probably a reason he had managed to stay alive this long, at least for now. Meanwhile, Ryan rode deeper into the Imperial Forest while carefully reviewing everything he knew. The enormous hunting grounds were divided into 3 major regions, ranging from areas filled with small animals near the entrance to territories populated by giant beasts deep within the woods. Looking over his map, Ryan analyzed each hunting zone. According to the original story, Duke Agony would eventually present the Emperor with a rare golden fox. The problem was that the novel never explained where the Duke had actually found it. That lack of information was exactly why Ryan had spent so much time flying through the forest in crow form before the competition, trying to locate the creature himself. One detail from the story stood out in his memory. After the hunt, the Duke had washed his hands in a river. Using that clue, Ryan concluded that the fox was probably somewhere near the southwest lake and decided to get there before the Duke could. He was also grateful that Sign had successfully delivered the backpack full of energy stones because he intended to hand them over to Duke Agony later. Unfortunately, things suddenly went off the rails. The massive black horse beneath him began making strange noises and showing obvious discomfort from the weight of the backpack. Without warning, the horse stopped running and reared up violently, nearly throwing Ryan out of the saddle. Confused, Ryan dismounted and examined the animal as it angrily stomped the ground. Concerned, he asked if the horse was sick or if it had sensed a dangerous monster nearby. The horse simply shook its head. Then, a ridiculous possibility crossed Ryan's mind. Staring at the animal suspiciously, he asked if the backpack was simply too heavy. To his disbelief, the horse immediately nodded. Ryan was completely outraged. He complained that ordinary horses pulled entire wagons without throwing tantrums over a little extra weight. He even threatened to cut the horse's food supply if it kept acting stubborn. The horse clearly wasn't impressed. Determined to win the argument, it ignored him completely, kicked the ground aggressively, and suddenly bolted away into the forest. Ryan could only watch in disbelief as the black horse disappeared into the distance, leaving him stranded in the middle of the trail with the heavy backpack. Once the horse vanished from sight, he realized the ridiculous situation he had ended up in, and could only lament being abandoned so shamelessly by his own mount. Elsewhere in the Imperial Forest, the hunt continued beneath the sunlight filtering through the trees. Talon walked behind Duke Agony and commented with disappointment that their luck seemed terrible today. The Duke sighed and remarked that old age was finally catching up to him. Even after spending his life as the Empire's sword and shield, time remained an opponent he couldn't defeat. Talon quickly tried to encourage him, reminding him that he was still regarded as a living legend throughout the Empire. The assistant spoke about the Duke's glorious years as commander of the Imperial Knights, though the old man merely viewed himself as a retired veteran. Suddenly, the Duke asked whether Talon had ever seen members of the royal family up close. Talon admitted he had only ever glimpsed them from a distance during public ceremonies. The Duke explained that only those who stood directly before the royals could truly understand how imposing they were. His thoughts drifted back to years ago when he used to travel through the capital with his young son in a carriage. Back then, he would proudly point out the royal family and tell his son they were as magnificent as gods. He often spoke about how he was growing old and hoped the boy would someday succeed him in serving the empire. While riding through the city, he would proudly point toward the merchant fleets supplying the royal family and explain the greatness of the kingdom. He even planned to show his son the magnificent temple they were about to visit. Then the memory took a dark turn. Their carriage suddenly jolted violently, causing the driver to apologize and explain that something had become lodged beneath one of the wheels. The driver urgently asked the Duke to remain inside while he handled the situation. Looking outside, the Duke saw the lifeless body of a young boy lying in the middle of the cobblestone street. The luxurious imperial carriage wheel had been stained by the accident. He soon learned that the child was a homeless boy who had been caught attempting to steal sacred offerings from the temple. A nearby guard coldly remarked that deaths like this happened every day and were nothing unusual. Curious about the commotion, the Duke's son tried to step outside and see what had happened. The Duke immediately shouted with terrifying intensity, ordering him not to leave the carriage. Startled, the boy froze as his father physically blocked the door and insisted he must not look outside under any circumstances. Hiding his sorrow, the Duke quietly told his son that nothing important was happening. Back in the present, walking through the forest, the old knight remembered that the dead child hadn't even been 10 years old. The memory still haunted him. The boy had been younger than his own son, forcing the Duke to question the dark reality hidden beneath the Empire's grandeur. His thoughts were interrupted when Talon hurried over and reminded him they didn't have time to admire the scenery if they wanted to preserve their family's honor in the tournament. Shaking off the memories, the Duke apologized for drifting off and revealed that he knew a secret location nearby where the elusive golden fox usually appeared. Meanwhile, Ryan was practically dying as he dragged himself through the forest, carrying the absurdly heavy backpack. Exhausted and drenched in sweat, he swore that the moment he got his hands on that stubborn horse again, it was getting turned into barbecue. The weight of the magic stones was so ridiculous that he couldn't even transform into a crow and fly, making his search for Duke Agony far more difficult than expected. Even though this section of the Imperial Forest was considered the small animal zone, Ryan knew it was still dangerous for someone wandering around on foot without a weapon. Suddenly, rustling noises came from a nearby bush, instantly putting him on alert. His heart nearly jumped out of his chest as he imagined some dangerous creature approaching. The problem was that he hadn't brought any weapon with him and had no intention of abandoning the precious backpack. Acting purely on instinct, Ryan grabbed one of the heavy stones and hurled it at high speed toward the suspicious sound. Unfortunately, his aim was a little too good. The stone flew straight through the bushes and smashed directly into Talon's face. The impact was brutal. The poor assistant let out a painful scream before collapsing onto the forest floor. Hidden behind a nearby tree, Ryan stared in disbelief at the disaster he had just created. Meanwhile, Duke Agony immediately shouted for his assistant and rushed toward him. Ryan quickly crouched lower behind the bushes, desperately hoping they wouldn't discover him. The moment he spotted the unconscious man's blue hair, he instantly recognized him as Talon. Blood was already running down the assistant's face, and before long he passed out completely. Ryan's nerves went into overdrive. Out of all the ways he could have met the legendary Duke, accidentally launching a rock into his assistant's face had never crossed his mind. Standing only a short distance away was one of the Empire's greatest war heroes, the former commander of the Imperial Knights and the future mentor of the novel's true protagonist. This was the man who would eventually help shake the entire Empire. Ryan knew revealing himself now would be a complete disaster. Hidden behind the tree, he frantically tried to think of a solution. His original plan had already fallen apart. He had wanted to find the golden fox before before the Duke, accuse him of attempting to steal royal prey, and then force him to carry the backpack full of energy stones as punishment throughout the tournament. Instead, he had accidentally assaulted the Duke's assistant. While Ryan was having a silent meltdown, Duke Agony picked up the stone and immediately noticed how unusually heavy it was. Rather than assuming it was an accident, he concluded that someone had deliberately thrown it. In fact, he began suspecting that the true target wasn't Talon at all, but himself. A moment later, the injured assistant groaned and regained a bit of consciousness. The Duke quickly reassured him and asked if he remembered anything about the attacker. Ryan nearly had a heart attack. He knew exactly how powerful the Duke was, and if Talon described him even slightly, his entire situation would become a nightmare. Still dizzy and bleeding, Talon slowly tried to recall what he had seen. Ryan bit his lip in pure panic as the assistant struggled to describe the mysterious figure. After a painfully dramatic pause, Talon finally admitted that everything had happened too fast and that he hadn't seen anything at all. Ryan almost collapsed from relief. For one glorious second, it looked like disaster had been avoided. Then fate decided to make things worse. The Duke suddenly heard the sound of branches snapping nearby. His eyes immediately sharpened as he realized someone was still hiding close by and had been watching the entire exchange. Ryan instantly understood he had been busted. Without wasting another second, he grabbed the backpack and ran for his life. The Duke ordered Talon to stay where he was before charging after the intruder with sword in hand. A frantic chase erupted through the forest. Ryan sprinted between trees while carrying the absurdly heavy backpack, his legs screaming in protest. He desperately tried to convince himself he had already created enough distance to lose an elderly man. Then he glanced backward and nearly cried. Duke Agony was still right behind him, moving at a completely insane speed. The old knight shouted for him to stop and reveal his identity, making Ryan realize he was only seconds away from being caught. Desperate, he considered abandoning the backpack so he could transform into a crow. At that moment, he bitterly regretted ever being abandoned by his horse. With no better options left, he activated one of his hidden abilities to increase his speed. To his shock, his legs suddenly began transforming into the powerful hind legs of a horse. The burst of acceleration was immediate. Even the Duke looked confused as the fleeing figure's silhouette seemed to distort and change shape while rapidly pulling away. Despite his incredible strength, the Duke could no longer keep up. Frustration filled him as he watched the mysterious intruder vanish into the distance. Grinding his teeth, he wondered if old age was finally affecting his eyesight, because he could have sworn the target had started transforming while running. Eventually, he was forced to stop in an empty clearing and catch his breath, annoyed that the chase had ended with him losing sight of his quarry. Meanwhile, Ryan experienced something even stranger. His body suddenly felt unbelievably light, and his movement no longer felt human. As he continued racing forward, he heard the unmistakable sound of galloping hooves. For a brief moment, he actually wondered if his runaway horse had somehow returned to rescue him, but the truth became obvious when he caught sight of his own reflection. Staring at what he had become, Ryan realized something absolutely insane had happened. Somewhere during his desperate escape, he had fully transformed into a magnificent black racehorse. Elsewhere in the forest, one of the princes stumbled across something shocking. Lying before him was the freshly hunted corpse of a gigantic, monstrous creature. The blonde prince smiled in surprise and asked his brother if he had really managed to bring down such a legendary beast so early into the competition. Another prince congratulated the hunter and curiously asked what wish he planned to request from the emperor after securing such an impressive achievement. Wearing an enigmatic smile that carried a rather dark undertone, the prince calmly revealed that he already had something very special in mind. Meanwhile, in another part of the forest, Ryan sat against a tree trunk and let out a long sigh. He buried his hands in his hair as despair washed over him. Looking down, he suddenly realized the worst possible outcome had happened. Somewhere during his desperate escape from the Duke, he had lost the backpack filled with energy stones. The realization hit him so hard that he started rolling around in the grass, cursing his unbelievable bad luck and complaining that the tournament had gone far beyond the limits of acceptable disaster. After a few moments of self-pity, he admitted that lying around wouldn't solve anything. With no other choice, he got back on his feet and began retracing his steps in search of the missing backpack. Not far away, Tolan was still resting beside a tree when he noticed Duke Agony returning from the failed chase. Brightening up immediately, he asked about the outcome. The Duke first checked whether his assistant's head was feeling better. Tolan admitted he was still sore and dizzy, but otherwise fine. Embarrassingly, the Duke confessed that he had completely lost the intruder. He wasn't sure whether the target had simply been too fast or if he was finally feeling the effects of old age. During the conversation, Tolan pointed toward a leather backpack lying nearby. The Duke explained that he had found it abandoned along the path during the pursuit. When Tolan opened it, he became completely confused. The bag was filled with what appeared to be ordinary rocks. Hidden behind a nearby tree, Ryan watched the scene unfold while sweating bullets. They had found the exact backpack he had been desperately searching for. Panicking, he immediately jumped out of hiding and pointed toward the bag. The sudden appearance startled both men. The moment Tolan recognized him as the seventh prince, he and the Duke instantly dropped to their knees. Maintaining a calm expression, Ryan claimed he had merely been searching for his lost backpack. Then, Putting on the attitude of a spoiled and unreasonable noble, he angrily demanded to know why they had his belongings and openly accused them of stealing it. The Duke immediately denied the accusation and respectfully explained that he had only discovered the backpack abandoned in the grass. Ryan continued pressing him until the old knight practically swore on his family's honor that he was telling the truth. Ryan then shifted his attention toward Talon and asked why the assistant's face was covered in blood. The Duke awkwardly explained that they had suffered a sudden accident. Throughout the exchange, Talon remained silent with his head lowered. At the same time, vague memories were beginning to surface in his mind. He faintly remembered seeing the silhouette of Prince Ryan just before the stone struck him. As he prepared to speak up, Ryan suddenly stepped forward and grabbed him aggressively by the hair. In a cold and hostile tone, he berated the assistant for daring to interrupt a conversation between nobles, calling him an uneducated brat. Then Ryan casually asked the Duke if he could borrow a sword to personally deal with the problem. The threat instantly drained the color from Tolan's face. Terrified, he began pleading for his life. The Duke quickly apologized on his assistant's behalf and begged for mercy, promising to punish the boy himself if necessary. Watching this, Ryan couldn't help thinking bitterly about how easily the Duke was willing to sacrifice his own subordinate. In Ryan's eyes, the old knight behaved like a loyal dog serving the royal family without question. He even recalled that the Duke's son would one day grow into the exact same kind of loyal servant. For a brief moment, Ryan remembered the frightened face of that innocent child from the Duke's memories. Then, changing his demeanor, he smiled and claimed their encounter must have been fate. Handing the backpack over, he warned the Duke that the contents were extremely valuable and that losing them was absolutely unacceptable. The old war hero clutched the bag tightly and solemnly promised to obey the prince's instructions without question. After wishing them a successful hunt, Ryan finally left. Internally, he admitted his acting had been terrible and felt a little guilty for frightening Talon, but he knew this encounter had served an important purpose. After Ryan departed, Talon apologized repeatedly, clearly ashamed of everything that had happened. The Duke simply told him to be grateful he was still alive and suggested they return to rest. Suddenly, the assistant remembered something important. He confidently stated that he had finally figured out who had thrown the stone at him. According to Talon, the true culprit was none other than Prince Ryan himself. However, before he could explain his reasoning, the Duke immediately cut him off and ordered him to stop talking about it. Ryan's objective had never been the backpack or even the hunting competition. In the original novel, Duke Agony would launch a massive rebellion during the following year's tournament after the tragic death of his beloved son. Ryan wanted that rebellion to happen sooner. To accomplish that, all he needed was to give the Duke a small push in the right direction. Elsewhere, Rasha was already preparing the wish he intended to request from the Emperor. He planned to fund large-scale development projects around the Sacred Temple region. On the surface, it sounded beneficial, but his true goal was far darker. The project would force the homeless and impoverished residents out of the capital permanently. Watching events unfold from a distance, Ryan coldly reflected that Duke Agony's fate was now completely sealed. The old knight walked through the forest looking troubled and thoughtful after everything he had experienced that day. Whether he realized it or not, he was destined to one day stand against the royal family. As evening gradually covered the imperial forest in a beautiful crimson glow, the hunting competition approached its end. Hidden behind a patch of bushes, Ryan carefully checked his surroundings to make sure nobody was watching him. Looking toward the noble's tents, he reflected on how convincingly he had played the role of a ruthless villain. Then he quickly reminded himself that being a villain was exactly the role he was supposed to play. While planning his next move for the closing ceremony, he suddenly sensed someone standing behind him. The unexpected presence made him freeze. Turning around, he found himself face to face with the kingdom's first princess, Mentil Abiran. She greeted him kindly and remarked that it was unusual to see him wandering through the forest alone. Ryan immediately became tense. Out of all the people he could have encountered, the first princess was one of the most dangerous. He offered a formal greeting, but she gently asked him to stop being so formal with his own sister. Curious, she asked where he had left his horse. Ryan quickly lied and claimed he had left it at his quarters before deciding to take a walk. The princess stared at him with a suspicious expression and bluntly stated that his explanation made no sense. Then she directly accused him of lying to his own blood sister. Ryan swallowed hard but forced himself to remain calm as he asked what exactly she meant. Mentil revealed that she had personally seen his black horse running loose through the western forest without a rider. After learning from the servants that the animal belonged to him, she had already ordered it to be put down. According to her, any animal that disobeyed royalty deserved elimination. Ryan immediately dropped to one knee and apologized, pretending to be ashamed that he had lost control of the horse. The princess gently told him to stand up, explaining that she had no desire to appear as though she were punishing her younger brother. She expressed relief that he had returned safely, and even offered to lend him one of her own horses whenever he needed one. Ryan watched her leave while remaining deeply unsettled. Mentil Abiran was an incredibly dangerous woman because she never allowed her true thoughts to show. The entire conversation felt wrong. He couldn't understand why she had chosen to let the matter end so peacefully. As he watched her disappear into the distance, he couldn't help wondering whether her mysterious magical ability had somehow failed to work on him. Night finally settled over the royal camp. Inside one of the large noble tents, The camp doctor examined Talon's injury with a puzzled expression. According to the explanation he had been given, the assistant had supposedly tripped over a rock and smashed his head against another while running. The doctor admitted he had never seen someone suffer such a serious injury from a simple fall during any previous hunting tournament. Duke Agony asked how long the recovery would take, and the doctor replied that the wound was severe enough to require at least a week of bed rest. Hearing that, Talon immediately protested. As the Duke's assistant, he insisted he needed to remain at his lord's side. The Duke simply placed a hand on his shoulder and acknowledged his loyalty, before firmly stating that recovery came first. He ordered Talon to stay in bed and rest until the closing ceremony. Rather than remaining disappointed, the young assistant suddenly broke into a huge smile and promised to dedicate himself completely to resting. The Duke laughed and joked that Talon was probably the first assistant in tournament history to treat an injury like a vacation. Talon cheerfully admitted that his greatest dream was simply to eat and play all day. Amused by the response, the Duke laughed along and promised that if he won the competition, he would use his reward to request the mining rights to a gold mine for him. Later that night, the entire camp fell silent beneath the dim glow of a single candle. Exhausted from both his injury and the pain medication, Talon quickly drifted into a deep sleep, snoring loudly in his bed. While he slept peacefully, an unseen hand quietly entered the tent and placed a rolled, sealed document beside his pillow before disappearing without a trace. Elsewhere, Ryan couldn't help mocking the royal family's so-called loyalty. In his eyes, they treated their servants as nothing more than disposable tools to be used and discarded whenever convenient. He knew Duke Agony's rebellion was drawing closer with every passing day. Eventually, the endless abuses of the royal family would push the old warrior beyond his breaking point. Meanwhile, sleep refused to come to the Duke. Restless and troubled, he climbed out of bed and prepared to take a walk outside. Just before leaving the tent, however, something unexpected caught his attention. Sitting on a nearby stand was the luxurious backpack Ryan had entrusted to him earlier. The strange energy stones inside were producing an odd rattling noise, as though they were shifting and striking each other on their own. Without really thinking about it, the Duke picked up the incredibly heavy bag and carried it with him into the night. As he walked through the darkness, old memories surfaced in his mind. He recalled conversations with his father about the Empire's origins and the sacred temple. Back then, his father had enthusiastically spoken about a divine savior who descended from the heavens during an age of endless war and chaos. Young Agony had proudly responded that he already knew the story from his history books and recognized the figure as the Great Sierra. According to the legends, Sierra possessed mysterious powers and had succeeded where countless rulers failed. More than 1,000 years ago, the divine being united the warring lands and founded the Iberian Empire, becoming the ancestor of the royal bloodline itself. The Duke's thoughts soon drifted toward his beloved son, Flynn. To him, Flynn was the most precious thing in the entire world. As he walked through the forest carrying the backpack, he silently swore once again to remain the Empire's faithful sword and shield, and to continue protecting the Iberian family with unwavering loyalty. Then reality abruptly interrupted his thoughts. Looking down at the absurdly heavy bag of stones hanging from his shoulder, he suddenly wondered why he was carrying it around in the middle of the night. Was it loyalty, stubbornness, or something else entirely? Before he could think further, a loud horn blast echoed across the forest. The unexpected signal immediately caught his attention, making him wonder if something major had happened. The following day, every noble gathered at the competition grounds was left stunned by an unbelievable announcement. During a single night, First Prince Rasha had used his overwhelming power to nearly wipe out every monster within the hunting grounds by himself. The achievement was so absurd that he effectively ended a tournament designed to last 4 full days in only one night. His victory wasn't just decisive, it was historic. Standing before the assembled crowd, Rasha was officially declared the undisputed winner of the hunting competition. The emperor congratulated his eldest son for the crushing performance, and Rasha respectfully thanked him while maintaining the flawless posture expected of imperial royalty. Following tradition, the emperor then ordered him to announce the wish he wanted granted. As whispers spread through the audience, many nobles eagerly speculated about what reward he would request. Among them stood Duke Agony, watching nervously. Then Rasha finally revealed his wish. He claimed that the sacred temple's surroundings had become overrun with beggars and undesirables who threatened the site's security and dignity. To restore the temple's former glory, he requested authorization for large-scale restoration and development projects across the entire region. The moment those words left Rasha's mouth, Duke Agony froze. Unlike most people present, he immediately understood what the proposal truly meant. Memories flooded back into his mind, images of imperial soldiers mercilessly removing innocent poor families from the area in the past. This wasn't restoration, it wasn't purification, it was a death sentence for countless helpless people living around the temple. The Duke felt his chest tighten as he remembered his father and the ideals he had inherited. Was blind loyalty really worth this price? Was faithfully serving the Empire worth ignoring the suffering of innocent children? He mentally called out to his late father while a crushing sense of anguish settled over him. To continue being the Empire's loyal hound would mean pretending not to see the coming massacre. For years, he had endured and obeyed, decade. But this time, something finally broke. Unable to tolerate the injustice any longer, Duke Agony made his decision. In front of the emperor, the royal family, and the gathered nobles, he slowly drew his shining sword. As he did, he silently apologized to his beloved son Flynn for abandoning the oath their family had upheld for generations. Meanwhile, inside the medical tent, Talon suddenly woke up and nearly had a heart attack. Hovering directly over his bed was an upside-down figure staring at him with a completely blank expression. Ryan stood there silently, watching him without a hint of emotion. Startled, Talon immediately tried to jump up and greet the prince, but Ryan sharply ordered him not to move so quickly unless he wanted to make himself dizzy. He then coldly advised him to use olive leaves on the injury before abruptly changing the subject. Ryan asked whether Talon seriously had no idea about the massive trouble Duke Agony was currently facing. The words instantly erased any remaining sleepiness. When Talon realized the closing ceremony had already begun without him, his eyes widened in panic. He bolted out of the medical tent and sprinted toward the gathering of nobles. Pushing through the crowd with desperate urgency, he ignored everyone in his path until he finally reached the front. The moment he saw what was happening, he froze in horror. Right before the emperor himself, First Prince Rasha was preparing to execute Duke Agony. Rasha's face twisted with fury as he demanded to know why the Duke had committed the heresy of interrupting the sacred closing ceremony. In response, Duke Agony calmly explained that his family had faithfully protected both the empire and the royal family for over 1,000 years. Because of that legacy, he requested permission for his family to personally assume responsibility for the security of the sacred temple. In reality, he was trying to prevent Rasha from carrying out the massacre of the poor and helpless people living around it. To everyone's shock, the emperor granted the request. Acknowledging the Duke's centuries of loyalty, he agreed to place the responsibility in his hands. However, he couldn't resist pointing out the irony. The same loyalty the Duke proudly claimed had led him to stand against the royal family's wishes. Rasha immediately exploded with rage. Refusing to accept the interruption, he unleashed the full force of his water magic and charged forward. The crown prince declared that such insolence deserved the ultimate punishment. Duke Agony lowered his head and calmly accepted the judgment, stating that if interrupting the ceremony was a crime, he was willing to pay for it with his life. Watching from the crowd, Talon screamed in desperation for his lord. Nearby, Ryan observed everything with chilling calm, silently thinking how perfect this moment would be if the novel's true protagonist happened to witness it. Far away from the ceremony, deep within a peaceful section of the imperial forest, a mysterious hooded young man crouched beside a river collecting water. Suddenly, the flowing stream began glowing with intense blue magical energy. Startled, the young man looked around, trying to determine where such an overwhelming surge of power was coming from. The glowing torrent swept through the forest like a living current, carrying with it a glimpse of the royal family's terrifying strength. The young man watched carefully as the magical energy spread across the land. This wasn't just some random traveler. Standing there was the true protagonist of the story, the legendary young man known as Rattel. Back at the ceremony, Duke Agony, the hero whose family had protected the royal bloodline for more than a millennium, was now being treated like a criminal. Rasha personally took it upon himself to carry out the execution in the name of the royal family. A massive sphere of water suddenly engulfed the Duke, trapping him inside and cutting off his ability to breathe. The spectators immediately panicked as they watched the old warrior slowly suffocate. Locked inside the crushing prison of water, Agony struggled for air while his vision began to blur. Within that watery prison, his gaze eventually landed on Talon. The sight immediately caught his attention. He wondered why the boy had left the medical tent and come all the way there. Realizing that Talon had likely exaggerated his injury, the Duke felt relieved to see him alive and well. As he stared at the desperate young assistant, regret filled his heart. He silently wished he could tell Talon to look after his beloved son Flynn after he was gone. Then something unexpected pulled his attention away. Standing among the crowd, completely calm amidst the chaos, was Prince Ryan. The Duke narrowed his eyes, trying to understand what the young prince was silently mouthing. Ryan's lips moved without making a sound, but the message was clear. It wasn't the Duke's time to die yet. Those words reignited something inside him. The old warrior's resolve returned instantly. He refused to accept death there. At the same time, Rasha gathered even more magical power. A colossal pillar of blue light erupted into the heavens as an enormous sphere of energy illuminated the entire forest. The water barrier surrounding the Duke came under tremendous strain and slowly began cracking apart. Rasha raised his hand to deliver the final judgment, while Talon watched helplessly from outside, restrained by those around him. Meanwhile, Ryan simply continued observing the situation with a thoughtful expression. Elsewhere, the shock waves of that immense power began attracting attention across the empire. A young boy quietly writing in a notebook suddenly stopped and looked out the window after noticing a brilliant beam of magical light streaking across the sky. Deep within the forest, Rattel also spotted the mysterious glow. Instantly recognizing that something unusual was happening, he sprinted toward it without hesitation. Moving at incredible speed, he leaped forward and landed with enough force to shake the ground around him. Driven by determination, he pushed onward until he finally reached the area where the massive energy barrier was concentrated. The blinding light made it difficult to see clearly, but after staring into the glow, he thought he could make out a silhouette trapped inside. Without fear, Rattel jumped directly toward the strange phenomenon. Reaching out, he touched the magical barrier in an attempt to understand what it was. The moment contact was made, a violent reaction occurred. A massive explosion of water erupted outward, sending waves crashing in every direction. Rattel managed to land safely on solid ground, but when he looked around, the energy trail was already fading into the sky beyond the mountains. Standing at the edge of a cliff, he carefully studied the destruction left behind. Something about the entire situation felt deeply wrong. As the final traces of magical energy vanished into the distance, Rattel turned back with a suspicious look, convinced that something far more serious was unfolding behind the scenes. Back at the ceremony, Talon was devastated by what appeared to be the death of Duke Agony. The crowd whispered among themselves about the fallen hero's tragic end and speculated about the future of the fetus family. Treating the matter as finished, the emperor ordered preparations for the final ceremony at noon. One by one, nobles and participants began leaving the arena. Rasha casually wiped his hands and dismissed the duke's death as the crushing of an insignificant bug. He openly remarked that excessive mercy only created rebellious fools. As the crowd dispersed, many nobles mocked the late duke behind his back, calling him an idiot and predicting the complete collapse of his family. Meanwhile, Talon walked through the crowd alone with his head lowered. Some nobles even spat near him and branded him a traitor's servant, but he ignored every insult. Watching from a distance, Ryan knew the young assistant's heart had been shattered. Even so, he was convinced that Talon's spirit wouldn't break. After returning to the duke's tent, Talon began cleaning up the scattered belongings left behind. While sorting through the mess, he discovered a sealed letter hidden beneath a pile of fabric. Recognizing the fetus family seal, he immediately opened it. The letter contained Duke Agony's final words. The old warrior wrote that if Talon was reading it, he was likely already gone. He made one last request, asking his loyal assistant to look after his son Flynn. Agony confessed that he felt he was about to make a terrible mistake and wanted to ensure Talon bore no responsibility for whatever happened afterward. As the letter continued, it revealed something completely unexpected. Moved by the duke's sincerity, Talon dropped the paper and collapsed to the floor in tears. The letter officially named him the substitute head of the entire fetus family. Meanwhile, inside one of the royal chambers, Ryan discussed Rasha's deteriorating condition. He pointed out that the first prince's reckless use of magic during the tournament had significantly worsened his illness. The remark immediately infuriated Rasha, who demanded answers regarding the dark stone that was supposedly absorbing the corrupted energy inside him. Ryan calmly explained that his brother needed to release his power much more slowly if he wanted to avoid accelerating his decline. Looking into Rasha's eyes, Ryan could clearly see the hatred building there. He knew the crown prince was already plotting revenge. Still, Ryan reminded him that there was no instant cure for his condition, and that he was only alive because of the stone. Elsewhere, Ryan briefly thought about the rumors claiming Talon remained unconscious. Despite everything, he felt a small amount of guilt and wondered whether the assistant would actually survive. Around that same time, Talon finally opened his eyes. Disoriented, he struggled to understand where he was. A servant quickly informed him that he had spent over 2 weeks unconscious. Ignoring all advice to rest, Talon immediately asked about Flynn and the family's situation. The servant sadly explained that most business partners had withdrawn their support, many employees had abandoned the household, and their finances were collapsing. Worse still, no one could ask the royal family for assistance because Duke Agony had been branded a traitor. As Talon processed the grim news, a small voice echoed through the hallway. Little Flynn had arrived. The moment he saw the boy, Talon became emotional and rushed forward before dropping to his knees in apology. He blamed himself for causing so much worry. Flynn sadly explained that countless problems had appeared after his father's death and that they hadn't even managed to organize a proper memorial service. During their conversation, Talon overheard cruel gossip coming from outside the window. Curious, he listened more carefully and heard people spreading rumors about Flynn's birth while discussing plans to flee before they suffered punishment for being associated with traitors. The comments made it clear that the stain attached to the fetus family name would be difficult to erase. When Talon turned back toward the room, his expression had completely changed. Calling for one of the servants, he coldly ordered that the gossipers outside have their tongues cut out as punishment. The servant was horrified by the command, but when Talon asked if he needed to repeat himself, the man could only bow and obey. Then Talon announced another shocking decision. There would be no memorial service. According to him, the former duke could no longer be considered part of the proud fetus family. Flynn tearfully demanded an explanation, but Talon remained firm. As the newly appointed family leader, it was now his duty to preserve the family's honor and protect the clan until Flynn came of age. Removing his glasses with unwavering resolve, he declared that he would use whatever methods were necessary to keep the fetus family standing. Elsewhere, tension continued building inside Rasha's quarters. Consumed by rage, the first prince smashed furniture and valuables throughout his room. Unable to accept his current state, he vented his frustration until he was left exhausted and struggling to breathe. A maid who entered the room was immediately frightened by the destruction surrounding him. Rasha swore he would crush every one of his enemies. Meanwhile, Ryan calmly informed him about an appointment planned for the following day and requested that rumors be spread, claiming he would be entering the Imperial Forest. Confused, Rasha questioned why Ryan would bother spreading such information if he had no intention of actually going there. Ryan explained that he needed to keep his true location hidden while handling important business. Growing increasingly suspicious, Rasha demanded to know what kind of scheme required such secrecy. Ryan answered with a sarcastic smile, claiming it was related to the treatment. The response only enraged the Crown Prince further. Completely losing control, Rasha grabbed Ryan and slammed him against a wall, declaring that the Empire's sages could easily provide a cure. He attempted to choke Ryan using water magic while threatening to kill him on the spot. Even while being attacked, Ryan continued smiling mockingly and encouraged him to consult the sages if he was so confident. The moment Rasha pushed his power too far, his condition immediately worsened. He began coughing violently and spat blood onto the floor. Ryan calmly stood up and reminded him that every use of magic shortened his lifespan. He warned that stopping the treatment would eventually leave him unable to move at all. Then Ryan mocked him further, questioning how the royal family would react if the mighty Crown Prince suddenly collapsed. As Rasha struggled on the floor, Ryan continued hammering away at his pride, reminding him that another heir would gladly claim the throne if he failed. Grabbing his brother's face, Ryan coldly warned him to start thinking instead of acting recklessly. Before leaving, he advised Rasha to abandon any plans of following him because he already knew how to disappear without leaving a trace. After leaving the room, Ryan reflected on his own motivations. Moments later, he transformed into a black crow and soared through the sky, carrying a small leather pouch in his claws. His destination was the Imperial Forest. Landing in a secluded area, he shed his feathers and returned to human form. Looking around, he proudly noted that he had already cleared the area of every living creature. He had deliberately chosen the location because he wanted to study his mysterious transformation powers without interruptions. Ryan strongly suspected he could transform into multiple species and wanted to determine exactly where the limits of that ability lay. To understand the power completely, he needed to identify every condition required to unlock new transformations. Based on his previous experiences, he theorized that physical contact with an animal might be the key. Since he had already transformed into both a crow and a horse after direct contact, the pattern seemed promising. Determined to test the theory properly, Ryan built a simple wooden trap among the bushes. Using expensive fruits stolen from the Imperial kitchen as bait, he prepared to catch a small animal and see whether contact with it would unlock yet another transformation. While setting up his trap in the forest, Ryan suddenly heard the sound of rustling leaves and immediately went on alert. Looking up, he spotted a cute squirrel carefully observing the wooden trap from a nearby tree. The sight caught him off guard. He hadn't even finished preparing the trap yet, and his target had already shown up. To his surprise, the squirrel quickly scampered down the trunk and approached him without the slightest fear. Before Ryan could react, the tiny creature climbed directly onto the hand holding the bait. Amused by its boldness, he jokingly remarked that trusting strangers so easily was a terrible survival strategy. Since he had finally achieved physical contact with another animal, Ryan decided it was the perfect opportunity to test his theory. Planting his feet firmly, he focused all of his concentration on transforming into a squirrel. A bright yellow energy immediately began radiating from his body. For a moment, it looked like the transformation was actually working. Then the glow abruptly faded, leaving him standing there exactly as he was, still human. Ryan frowned and began analyzing the failure. Maybe physical contact alone wasn't enough. He started wondering whether emotions or instinctive urges played a role. Perhaps he needed to genuinely experience a squirrel's desire to climb trees or gather food before the ability would activate. Before he could continue experimenting, disaster struck. The squirrel suddenly grabbed his backpack filled with valuable energy stones and bolted away at incredible speed. Ryan nearly had a heart attack. The little thief was making off with some of his most important possessions. Panicking, he immediately sprinted after it through the forest while desperately trying to get the backpack back. Somehow, he managed to catch hold of one of the straps at the last second. Unfortunately, the squirrel refused to surrender. Clinging stubbornly to the prize, it raced up a tree while dragging the backpack with it. Ryan pulled back with all his strength while the squirrel fought from the opposite side. What followed was a completely ridiculous tug-of-war between a prince and a squirrel. For a brief moment, neither side gave ground. Then fate intervened. The strap suddenly snapped under the pressure. Ryan instantly lost his balance and crashed flat onto his back while the squirrel escaped once again. By the time the exhausting chase finally ended, he had accomplished absolutely nothing except spending the entire day getting humiliated by a tiny woodland criminal. Later that night, the Imperial Palace rested beneath a sky filled with glowing moons and countless stars. One of the maids gently knocked on Ryan's door and informed him that dinner had arrived. After receiving permission to enter, she carefully stepped inside carrying a food tray. Silently, she prayed she could complete the task without attracting the prince's anger. The moment she entered, however, she nearly jumped out of her skin. Ryan's clothes were completely covered in dirt, leaves, and dust. When questioned, Ryan casually made up an excuse about taking a walk through the palace gardens. Internally, he was relieved that nobody had discovered his activities in crow form. At the same time, he couldn't help regretting that he had wasted an entire day chasing a squirrel only to learn absolutely nothing about his powers. While placing the food down, the maid noticed something strange beside him and stared at it curiously. Ryan asked her to fetch fresh clothes because he intended to take a bath, but instead of moving, she hesitated awkwardly. Confused by her reaction, he asked what was wrong. Nervously pointing toward the bag, she asked whether he had intentionally brought that little creature back with him. Ryan followed her gaze and immediately froze. To his utter disbelief, the squirrel had somehow snuck into his backpack and followed him all the way back to the palace. As if mocking him, the little troublemaker jumped out and began running around the room. Ryan immediately chased after it while the maid panicked. Convinced the prince was about to kill the animal, she desperately begged him to spare its life. Ryan ignored the misunderstanding completely and simply repeated his order to fetch new clothes. Unfortunately, the maid was so distracted by the squirrel that she failed to move. Losing patience, Ryan finally snapped and shouted at her to bring the clothes already. Terrified, she practically launched herself out of the room and sprinted through the palace corridors. The entire way, she worried that if she took too long, the poor squirrel would meet a terrible fate at the prince's hands. However, her frantic escape came to an abrupt halt when she rounded a corner and nearly collided with one of the most intimidating figures in the entire palace. Standing directly in her path was the first princess, Mentil Abiran. The maid froze instantly. Mentil immediately recognized her as one of Ryan's servants and calmly asked why she was running around in such a hurry. The terrified maid dropped to the floor and began begging for forgiveness. The princess then noticed the bundle of clothing in her hands and became suspicious. For a moment, she wondered if the servant had stolen them. Panicking, the maid swore she had done nothing wrong and quickly explained that Prince Ryan had merely dirtied his clothes. Mentil slowly extended her glowing hand toward the servant. In a cold voice, she warned that lying to her was pointless because she would uncover the truth regardless. Activating her unique mind-reading ability, the princess searched through the maid's memories to verify the story. The moment she saw what the servant had witnessed, her glowing eyes widened slightly in surprise. Instead of finding memories of Ryan strolling through a garden, she saw images of him covered in dried leaves and forest debris. Mentil instantly realized her younger brother had been somewhere far different than he claimed. As the pieces started falling into place, an enigmatic smile slowly appeared on the first princess's face.